America's longest war could not conquer the might of the Taliban, as the war on terror comes to a surprising end with the Taliban taking over the country. But how did the Taliban manage to defeat the strongest military power in the world? In this video, we'll cover the entire story. Before we get into the formation of the Taliban, we need to understand the history of the last 50 years in Afghanistan and how the events that led to the formation of the now seemingly invisible Taliban. It all started when the Soviet Union entered Afghanistan under the pretense of upholding Soviet-Afghan Friendship Treaty, but the real agenda was to support the communist-led coup. In 1979, the Soviets sent in 15,000 soldiers and immediately took control of the capital and the majority of the country. As expected, this didn't sit well with America, especially when the wounds of Vietnam were still fresh. The United States, aligned with Pakistan, funded and trained the Afghan Mujahideens. They promoted the jihadi philosophy in the Afghans and fueled the tradition of unacceptable of any foreign rule in the land of Afghanistan. By early 1986, the Pakistani intelligence agency ISI, funded by America, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, was annually training 16,000 to 18,000 Mujahideens, the rebels. And then this massive number went on to train thousands of other Afghanis, and the chain reaction began. Long story short, the Afghan Mujahideen succeeded in their jihad against foreign rulers, and the Soviets had to shamefully withdraw from the land of Khorasan by 1989. The CIA played a key role in the victory. They supplied the Afghans with game-changing Stinger missiles. With these shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, the Mujahideen were able to neutralize the Soviets' air power. But it's the events after the Soviet left that led to the formation of the Taliban we know today. The Soviets were defeated and America had achieved its goal, so it mostly left the Afghans to sort out their own affairs and left Pakistan to deal with whatever problems they might face as well. The different Mujahideen rebels then turned on each other and weren't able to form an inclusive government for the sake of Afghanistan. Instead, what transpired was a divided Islamic fundamentalist rebels that soon became unbearable for the public. Soon the country entered a civil war, and foreign parties like the ISI played a key role in supporting particular Mujahideen groups for the strategic and favorable future government of Afghanistan. Many of the Mujahideens at the time accused the ISI as the main instigator in the conflict between the Mujahideens. However, even though the main events of the civil war and its end are well known to the world, the ground realities ain't discussed as often. The divided rebel rule came with separate Islamic fundamentalism for some and practices prohibited in the Islamic law for others. The general public had to pay taxes upon entering different rebel area and follow different regulations set by different rebels. But that's not the worst part. It's also reported that some rebels used to kidnap beautiful women and men. This strictly un-Islamic practice was too much for the general public to handle. But they couldn't do anything against the heavily armed warlords of the Mujahideens and their rebels. All they could do was stay patient and endure and hope for a better future. In the midst of this cruelty, Mullah Omar emerged as a sign of hope for the people. Mullah Omar himself wasn't an educated version of Islam or anything. He was joining the cause to bring stability in the country by students of Arabic madrasa called the Taliban. Now you know what the word Taliban means and from where the current Taliban came from. The cause of the Taliban at the time was the heart's desire of the frustrated Afghanis suffering at the hands of the rebels. Most people welcomed Mullah Omar and his cause with open arms and even started handing over their weapons. Even Galmadun Hekmatyar, who was close to making the final move for the capital, stepped aside for the Mullah. He then later founded the Islamic States of Afghanistan in 1996, and he was recognized by the USA, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The new government was run by extremist Muslims of the highest order. The narrow-mindedness and extreme sectarian beliefs were deeply rooted in the Taliban. The implementation of the Islamic law greatly exceeded the likes of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Women were directed to always have burqa in public. Men were directed to have a specific type of beard. Even the barbers were penalized for shaving someone's beard. But perhaps the worst part of their government was the sectarian hate, especially against the Shia Muslims of the country. During the 4-year run of the Taliban, Iranian embassy was attacked and Shia Muslims were killed. The Hazara community of Shia Muslims was even subjected to persecutions in the name of jihad during the Taliban government. Thousands of Hazara lost their lives and were persecuted throughout the 90s. The Hazara community then went on to join the Northern Alliance that overthrew the Taliban government in 2001 after 9/11. Despite following an extremist interpretation of Islam and having no political sense and view of the Islamic system, the Taliban did impose some legitimate Islamic rights. Saudi Arabia and Iran happen to be the most prominent examples of the effect on society following Islamic law. The deterrence philosophy of Islam significantly reduces the crime rates. The Taliban implemented the Islamic punishment in the country and it kept people away from committing crimes. It's also noticeable that those in power backed Mullah Omar's decisions. With just one direction from their leader, they ended farming opium, which was well used for illegal drug trade and was a major source of income for the people. On September 11, 2001, America was struck with one of the biggest disasters in its history. We all know what happened after that. America invaded Afghanistan because they had provided refuge to Osama bin Laden and didn't hand him over to America. The Taliban repeatedly insisted on being shown the conclusive evidence they had against Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Pakistan, who was the only country which had diplomatic relations with the young Taliban government, acted as a mediator and tried to convince the Taliban to hand over bin Laden. Pakistan had already agreed to providing their airspace to America for military action against the Taliban if they didn't comply, but the Taliban refused to comply without evidence that shows Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda being involved in 9/11. The US refused to share their conclusive evidence with the Taliban. They also refused to share their evidence with Pakistan either. Instead, they revealed it to their NATO allies who in turn confirmed that it was indeed conclusive. In response to this, the Taliban ambassador said, if they are giving it to other countries, it belonged to them, not to us. They haven't given it to us. It was later revealed to the world that the evidence wasn't conclusive enough to link Osama bin Laden to 9/11 attacks, or at least that's what the stronger narrative is. Bin Laden did have some connections to the pilots on board the aircraft of 9/11, and he was found to have said that soon there will be a massive event. That's what's believed to be against bin Laden. Regardless of the speculated reasons behind the US invasions, in the eyes of the Western world, it was a wounded lion that rightly seek revenge and justice. So the US invaded Afghanistan and together with NATO ended the Taliban rule in the country. The United States then helped form a new government with a new constitution and aid. After the general election, Hamid Karzai was elected as the president of the country. The Taliban had to retreat, and as history unfolded before us, began a US war on terror that lasted 20 years. We are well informed on the Western narrative on the entire situation, but ever since 9/11, the legitimacy of both 9/11 and the US invasion has been suspected, and even believed to have other agendas, whether it be to access the oil and gas reserves of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan that meets 1/3 of Persian Gulf reserves through Afghanistan and Pakistan, or the massive mineral potential of Afghanistan with abundance of minerals that will shape the coming years, or the Western world's anti-Islamic narrative as establishment of new Islamic government was enough to trigger the Western nations. Some even go ahead and say that the establishment of Islamic system required another US and other nations to do something about it. Wars, as you might suspect, are expensive and cannot be run without public support. They needed, as they say, a probable cause. According to the speculations, 9/11 was the bell harbor that allowed the Western world to take serious action against Afghanistan under the pretense of war on terror, when the real reason could be to nip the Islamic system in the bud. Even George W. Bush used the term crusade in one of his speeches, which he later retracted. Similarly, the staunch protesting group from Philadelphia, in their monthly paper, the Philadelphia Trumpet, fueled the crusading narrative in the new war against a Muslim nation. The ex-ISI chief Hamid Gul, who played a major role in Afghanistan, also called 9/11 a hoax by the US and its allies to invade this part of the world. All of these are some very strong narratives. Some, if really true, will show we witnessed one of the biggest conspiracies against both the national and international public. Wherever the truth is, we will let you make up your own mind on the entire thing. Our job, as the title says, is to bring you the uncensored realities from all angles. One thing that the world must accept now, if they didn't before, is that the Afghan population never accepts foreign interference in their land. The British learned that the hard way. The Soviets also learned that the hard way. And now America have finally accepted that after 20 years in the worst way. Even before these countries, one only need to read the Afghan history to know that the Afghans are some of the most tough and stubborn people on the planet. After the Taliban's first government came to a forceful end, the era of another Afghan jihad began. The US poured money and manpower into the country as he aimed to maintain the newly formed government while fighting off the Taliban. The Taliban viewed the new government as puppet of foreign invaders. There was no legitimacy of the Hamid Karzai establishment in the eyes of the Taliban. Their agenda was to force resistance in Afghanistan, fight off the US and its puppet government, and restore the Taliban rule, which in turn would establish a true Islamic society. After the establishment of new constitution and precedent in Afghanistan, the US promoted the democratic rule while committing to bettering Afghan-US relations. George W. Bush said in 2005, it strengthened US-Afghan ties and helped ensure Afghanistan's long-term security, democracy, and prosperity. But the war against Taliban kept escalating. More and more soldiers, civilians, and Taliban kept dying. At one point in 2006, the NATO coalition began to crack. The US criticized the failure of other allied countries to not contribute in as much as the Americans. The allies were called unwilling to share the risk, commit the resources, and follow through on the collective commitment to this mission and to each other. The US put forward the notion that all achieved might slip away due to the lack of support from other countries. While the collateral damage and loss of civilian lives was getting bigger and bigger, the newly elected president of USA decided to commit more in the Afghan war, sending in 17,000 more troops. By the end of 2009, the Americans had 37,000 troops committed to the war. This number was supported by thousands of Afghan forces trained and armed by the United States, as well as other NATO forces. On May 1st, 2011, the US forces finally managed to kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. The death of America's primary target in the war that started 10 years ago fueled a long simmering debate about continuing the Afghanistan war. All while, the anti-Pakistan rhetoric increased in Afghanistan as many blamed Pakistan to have served as a safe haven for terrorists from where they continued to make lives hell for the Afghan people. Then in 2011, Obama, after being under pressure from lawmakers and the Democrat, announced the cutdown of US soldiers in Afghanistan. The US plan was to withdraw all combat troops by 2014. The 10-year war killed 1,800 US troops and cost them $444 billion. The president even confirmed that the US is holding introductory talks with the Taliban leadership. However, the hopes of dealing with the Taliban to help win down the conflict remain riddled with setbacks. In the 10th year of the war, dozens of countries and organizations met again in Bonn, Germany, to devise a roadmap of cooperation beyond the NATO troops withdrawal in 2014. The Afghani President Hamid Karzai asked the countries for 10 billion annual aid for Afghanistan to stabilize, construct, and increase security. He also promised them assurance against corruption for international assistance, but the conference failed to achieve any conclusion of transitioning Afghanistan to a self-sustaining and secure nation. In the following years, the tension between the Taliban and the US flared up as the Taliban cancelled introductory talks 2 months after establishing a Qatar office as a move towards peace talk. Then in 2013, the Afghan forces were handed complete control of security after NATO withdrawal from the responsibility of 95 districts. The US troops shifted focus on military training and special operation-driven counter-terrorism. It was also around the same time when the Taliban and the US officials resumed talks again. But Hamid Karzai believed that the office would recognize the legitimacy of the Taliban and serve as a diplomatic office. Therefore, he suspended negotiations with the US. The US had to negotiate a bilateral security agreement with Karzai's administration to keep military presence. Come 2014, the US sets a deadline for withdrawing troops in phases by the end of 2016. The on-record plan was to leave behind 9,800 US troops to carry out operations against what they called the remnants of Al-Qaeda. The US then had to broker an agreement between Ashraf Ghani, the new president, and Abdullah Abdullah, the opposition leader. In 2017, the United States dropped its most powerful non-nuclear bomb on suspected, self-proclaimed Islamic State militants at a cave complex in the eastern Nangarhar province. The new president Donald Trump even considered deploying thousands of more troops in Afghanistan. However, the Taliban appeared to be as strong as ever, to the extent that the US had to accept that they are not winning this war. At the time, the Taliban had control and contested more than a third of Afghanistan, and the conditions in Kabul were worse than ever. Donald Trump decided to prolong the Afghan war in order not to leave a vacuum for terrorists in the region by withdrawing. According to him, the withdrawal only depends on conditions on the ground, and to him, a political agreement with the Taliban was far off. He also invited India to put more efforts in rebuilding Afghanistan while blaming Pakistan for harboring insurgents. The new plans by the US were obviously unwelcome by the Taliban. They showed retaliation by carrying out several bold attacks in the capital. It killed over 115 people after a huge upsurge in violence and unrest. A main reason for such a strong response was the Trump's government direction to go against the Taliban in rural areas and destroy their opium labs, which was the main financial resources of the Taliban. 2019 started with the highest level of negotiations between the Taliban and US in Doha. The talks focused around the Taliban pledging to block international terrorists from using Afghan soil and the US withdrawing its troops from it. The US also insisted the Taliban engage in an intra-Afghan dialogue on the country's political structure and a ceasefire. However, by September of 2019, Donald Trump cancelled the peace talks a week after it was announced that an agreement had been reached in principle with Taliban leaders. Trump said that he did so because a US soldier was killed in a Taliban attack, but the Taliban said that they are committed to continuing negotiations. However, if the cancellation continues, the death rate will likely continue. Then in 2020, the Afghan Taliban finally signed a deal with the US that agreed that Afghanistan will not be used for terrorist activities on the condition of US troops withdrawal. The deal also included the agreement of intra-Afghan negotiations, but Ashraf Ghani insisted that the Taliban must meet his government's conditions first. The deal at the time did not include an immediate ceasefire, and some tensions still continued. Finally, in September of 2020, the Afghan government and the Taliban finally met for negotiations in Doha. They were made possible by the release of 5,000 Talibans from prison. Both parties agreed on the aim and need for peace and stability in Afghanistan. Both parties expressed their eagerness to draw out a framework for Afghan society after the US withdrawal. The Afghan government pushed for a ceasefire, and the Taliban once again reiterated the call for Islamic system. By the end of 2020, the US announced to halve their military presence in Afghanistan. They had already taken out thousands of soldiers by that point, following President Trump's campaign to end the war for good. However, the Taliban and the Afghan government still hadn't reached an agreement. This made NATO's Secretary General warn the US that withdrawing too early could let Afghanistan be a hub for terrorists. President Joe Biden announced that the US will not be able to withdraw by May 1st as per the agreement, but will completely leave the country by September 11, 2021. The US planned to withdraw whether an agreement is reached between the Taliban and the Afghan government or not. They would, however, support the Afghan forces for peacekeeping in the region. By this point, the Taliban said they will not participate in anything until the Americans and others leave. Finally, in the most surprising recent events, on September 15, 2021, the Taliban took over Kabul with next to no resistance after the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. This day marked victory for Taliban after 20 years of war. Looking at the capabilities, it seems almost bizarre that the strongest military of the world couldn't beat poorly armed rebels living in the mountains. The United States had 20 years and more money than 100 generations of the Taliban, but still couldn't get the job done. We know that these Afghani Mujahideens turned Taliban have been at war their whole lives. So how did they still have the might to embarrass a world superpower for 20 years and win in the end? The answer to this lies in both Afghan history and their religion. As said earlier, Afghans are some of the most stubborn people on the planet. They have never accepted foreign interference, but there is something even more sacred to the Afghans than their nationalism. It's the Islamic mindset and the desire to die fighting for their religion. In Islam, dying while fighting for justice or dying for the sake of Islam is the highest honor there is. It's called the Shaheed. So the question is, how can you win against an enemy whose biggest desire is to die at your hands? A lot of US soldiers was astonished by the motivation of the Taliban to die while fighting for their cause. It is these two things that have kept the Taliban from surrendering even in the harshest of conditions.